It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Philip Rubin. Philip is a cognitive scientist and science administrator. Throughout his career, he has carried out highly interdisciplinary research on cognition, particularly speech and language. He is particularly well known for his computational modeling of the physiology and acoustics of speech production and perception. He currently serves as senior advisor to the president at Haskins Laboratories, where he is also CEO Emeritus. Concurrently, he is a research affiliate in psychology and adjunct professor of surgery at Yale University. He recently retired from his position as Principal Assistant Director for Science and Technology in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. In that role, he led the White House Neuroscience Initiative, which is the subject of tonight's talk. Philip is a fellow of several organizations, including the PAAS, the Acoustical Society of America, and the Linguistic Society of America. He is a senior member of the IEEE and a member of the National Academy of Public Administration. Among many other awards and honors, he is also the recipient of the American Psychological Association's Meritorious Research Service Commendation, and he is a Trumbull College Fellow at Yale University. He earned a BA in Psychology and Linguistics from Brandeis and an MA and PhD in Experimental Psychology from the University of Connecticut. His talk tonight is entitled, Obama's Brain, A View of Science Policy from Inside the White House. Please hold questions to the end and join me in welcoming Philip to the podium. Well, you get a little preview here for those of you who speed read. Not sure I know how to get to it. There we go. Well, you don't. I thought I gave it to you. Where's yours? No. I gave it to you. All right, take it.
Can everybody hear me? Yes, it sounds good. So I'd like to thank the Philosophical Society of Washington and Larry Milstein. I'd also like to thank Tim for sponsoring this and the other co-sponsors. And in particular, I'd like to thank all of you who've joined me here tonight. On my way to my job interview at the White House, I got mugged and I got my neck broken. And that's the beginning of a long, interesting story that leads to some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about tonight. This is going to be a very different kind of talk. It's going to be a little bit wonky inside the Beltway. That's being intentionally done because I've had the opportunity to work for 3 presidents, and I've kind of noticed that aspects of science policy, even most scientists and most people who work in the federal government, are not very aware of what goes on behind the scenes. It's a very complex story, and mostly what I hope to do today is to give you a sense of some of the complexity and the fact that the things that you see and hear about and read in the newspaper really don't always happen the way they look like. And there's lots of people, particularly lots of scientists, lots of members of the public, lots of stakeholders working for many years that lead to the things that you read about. So I kind of missed my mugging because I was unconscious laying on the ground. and so I have no trauma associated with it. And I was coming, it was December 2011, I had received an email from the White House from a guy named Carl Wyman. Carl won the Nobel Prize in physics for something called Bose-Einstein condensate. So this was a form of matter that forms at very low temperatures. And it was predicted by Satyendra Bose and Albert Einstein. And then it was experimentally created. The first example was created by Carl Wyman, Eric Cornell, and with contributions for Wolfgang Ketterle in 1995. After Carl won the Nobel, and he won it when he was fairly young, when he was 40, he became interested in science education. And I had been interacting with him because we both shared boards at something called the National Academies of Science. So that's one of the beginnings of the wonky portion of this. So there are organizations, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the National Academies. They've rebranded themselves now, and they're now the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They used to be called the Institute of Medicine, which was going to play a role in this. The National Academies were started by President Lincoln in response to some activities and the need for scientific advice related to the Civil War. So, as you've seen in the history of the Philosophical Society and the National Academies, lots has been going, lots of activity in the scientific community. It's been going on for a lot of years. And I was playing a small role at chairing something called the Board on Behavioral Cognitive and Sensory Sciences. And I was pretty unhappy with things that I was seeing going on at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which I had been connected with two previous presidents, President Clinton and President Bush. I'm not going to go into the details. They're not particularly important. But I was also unhappy with some stuff going on at the National Academies related to STEM education. And I can be very vocal, so my complaints and my concerns were kind of loud and annoying and obnoxious, like I can be. And I got this email. It was a charming little email that said, if you're going to be in Washington for any reason, I'd like to talk to you about a couple things. So I said, oh, Carl's actually listening. So I was supposed to meet with him Monday morning. It was Saturday night, 11 o'clock. If people know Union Station, that's when they were just starting the construction. That's now completed out front. I walked about 14 steps outside, found myself unconscious on the ground. And it turns out I had just been knocked over by a bunch of kids, and a homeless person came to my rescue and protected me from them. So nothing was robbed, but I hit my head real hard. And I was unaware until later on Monday that I had broken my neck. But that is relevant because I was in a foul mood. In any case, so I was supposed to meet with somebody named Subra Suresh, who is the head of the National Science Foundation, on Sunday, and Cora Merritt, the deputy director. I showed up. I wasn't feeling well, went back to my hotel and said, we'll meet some other time. But I dragged myself even crankier over to the White House on Monday morning. Let me just make sure I know the technology. When I got to the White House, I started to whine and complain to Carl about a couple things, and he kind of said, he just waved me off. He said, take this piece of paper and read the piece of paper. Now, because it's a big audience and you can't see it, sometimes I do a handout and actually hand to people the actual piece of paper that he showed me. And when he handed it to me, I was actually terrified upon looking at it, because it was something called conference report language. Now we're getting very wonky. So when the House and the Senate agree on something, and they have slightly different language about what they're doing, they go to a conference committee, and they come to terms, and they come to some agreement. All wonderful, but for those who have been in the government for a while and deal with this stuff, that's an opportunity for lobbyists to slip language into stuff by passing a note, and all of a sudden, lots of your money goes to something that you didn't want to, that never saw the light of day. And I dealt with earmarks like that in the past, and whenever I'd see conference language, I go, oh my goodness, here goes somebody's money, and I wasn't pleased. But I looked at the language, and in part it read as follows. The conferees believe there is a potential in the near future for significant transformative advances in our fundamental understanding of learning, brain development, and brain health and recovery. Such advances will require enhanced tools to better understand the working of their brain, enhanced data and data infrastructure, and expanded interdisciplinary and large-scale research efforts. The language then, and I'm not going to read it all to you, then went on to encourage something called OSTP, and I'll get to detail what that is, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, to create an interagency working group on neuroscience and to start thinking about these issues. There was no directive language about spending money or taking money or doing anything. So Carl asked me, well, what do you think about this? And it was a lot more language than that. And I said, you know, I have just one word to use. I see opportunity here. It was clear that people had been giving a lot of thought to some pressing issues, which I'll get to in a moment, and that there was some opportunity here. And then Carl said, well, are you interested in running this thing? And I said, well, Carl, are you offering me a job? And he said, no, go in the next room and talk to those people. So I said, okay, and I went into some other room at a place called NEOF, the New Executive Office Building, a miserable place to go into any room. And there were 3 people who at the time I didn't know, and I became very close to. And at that time, I was really cranky. Now, I hire a lot of people over the years, and I've done a lot of interviews. This was the world's worst interview. I just wanted to get out of the room so bad. I wasn't feeling well at that point, and it was horrible. So, meanwhile, one of the alpha male guy in the room is like rolling his eyes, sighing. I'm going, oh. So the interview ends, and he goes, man, you just knocked it out of the park. I said, I knocked what out of what park? He said, best interview we've had in a long time. And I said, are you offering me a job? And he said, absolutely. And I said, what's the job? He says, I have no idea. So I said, I'll take it. I love the degree of chaos. So that kind of chaos is kind of where we, very reflective of how things actually work. It's not as orderly and coherent, and I'm going to start to drill down into some of the infrastructure. So I was asked to help create, because everything is part of a joint process, something called the White House Neuroscience Initiative. And let me unpack that. But before I do, why would this administration be interested in neuroscience? It turns out that there are a set of issues that range from the things, and again, I apologize for the small print, so I'll read stuff. So I put some little factoids that we used when we were briefing the president on many things, and some they'd been doing long before I got there. So neurological disorders affect more than 50 million Americans every year and cost more than $500 billion to treat. Every number that you see here just is going up, by the way. So these are old numbers that we did a few years ago. It's been projected that delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease by just 5 years could save $50 billion in annual U.S. healthcare costs. Nearly 800,000 Americans suffer a stroke. By the way, I had a stroke, a bad stroke, in 1998. So I've got a lot of neurological stuff that we'll get to. So they had a good person who had some experience, costing the United States an estimated $54 billion per year due to the expenses of healthcare services. Traumatic brain injury impacts approximately 2.5 million Americans each year. So there are a set of issues, particularly things like neurodegenerative disease, traumatic brain injury, both in terms of our service members, but also public sports, high school sports, a set of issues that were real challenges, and the state of the art was intriguing. It's clear that we were starting to know more, but there hadn't been a coherent effort. A decade before that, and the reason they asked me to join, I had helped start something at the National Science Foundation. I launched a number of programs, and one was the Cognitive Neuroscience program, but was also a part of some larger efforts that went on. But there wasn't a lot coherent going on. And so again, I mean, I, from my perspective, running my own small laboratories funded by NIH in the main, not NSF and not the White House, saw that, you know, we need to raise the visibility of neuroscience to the point that we're starting to mount a little bit more of a coherent effort. So the goals of this neuroscience initiative were to develop a strategy towards significant transformative discoveries in fundamental research and translational neuroscience and related areas like cognitive science development, learning, behavioral science, through coordinated federal efforts and synergy with outside stakeholders. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that coordinated effort, because the United States is different than other nations. We don't have a Ministry of Science. OSTP is not the office directing science. Instead, we have multiple semi-autonomous agencies, and we have some structures that I'm going to introduce you to that help to get some conversations going. OSTP, again, stands for Office of Science and Technology Policy. Its role is to incorporate and heighten the president's emphasis on neuroscience through administration-wide initiatives. Its role in this particular activity. So before I get to OSTP, I just wanted to give you a little sense of the White House in terms of where a place like OSTP sits. The place of science in the White House is centered in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but it again, is a cooperative activity between other wonky things. So I'm going to be introducing acronyms. Each time I do, I'm going to try to tell you what they are, and then eventually, during the second half, I'm going to start to get into some of the scientific detail too. But I wanted to give you a little bit of the structural background. So OSTP is one of many offices that make up the Executive Office of the President, the biggest one being the Office of Management and Budget, but then there are other key offices like the Council on Environmental Quality, a Council of Economic Advisors, Domestic Policy Council, National Security Council. So it's a moderately big enterprise at this point, and also includes the offices of the Vice President, Chief of Staff, Cabinet Affairs, Communications, Intergovernmental Relations, Public Engagement, Social Secretary, U.S. Trade Representative, and so on, and has a tiny, teeny budget, by the way. The budget is very small for all this stuff, and the way they do that is by getting people like myself who are detailed from other places, or often from universities who do the costs, or other agencies. So it's actually run fairly efficiently. One downside is you get enormous turnover. Approximate time in our office for somebody who's 18 months. And I've run organizations where I have people for 25, 30, 40 years. 18 months means you're not going to get a lot of corporate memory and a lot of turnover. So things are happening. And also, I apologize as following, but a lot of people are 12 years old. I mean, it's really young, and that's really exciting. But you go in sometimes, you go, whoa, there were like 3 people with gray hair there, myself, John Holdren, and a guy named Jeff Smith, and it can be a little startling because the youth is kind of very exciting. People are very talented, very enthusiastic, but it can be a little draining too because things are going fast, and I'm moving very slowly at that point. The mission of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and I don't want to dwell too long on it, but to just give you a quick sense, is first to provide the President and his senior staff with accurate, relevant, and timely scientific and technical advice on all matters of consequence. Second, to ensure that the policies of the executive branch are informed by sound science as opposed to made-up junk. This particular president is very hands-on and cared a lot, much to, I think, it would irritate his staff because he would read everything you gave him and jot down copious comments and notes in the margin. And they're kind of going, it's science, like move on to something else, we have important issues. But he spends a lot of time, which was good. And third, to ensure that the scientific and technical work of the executive branch is, and this is the crucial one, properly coordinated so as to provide the greatest benefit to society. So in terms of, and now we're getting really deep into the inside the beltway wonkiness, to coordinate the federal agencies, and you're going to see in a moment the depth and complexity without my going into too much detail. I'm just trying to give you a sense. There's something called the NSTC. It's the National Science and Technology Council. That's made up, this is inside the government only, and there are really 5 main branches of it. 5 large committees, one on environment, natural resources, one on homeland and national security, committee on science, which I co-chaired with Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, and Subra Suresh, the head of the National Science Foundation. And now it's co-chaired by Joe Handelsman, who was your previous speaker here. The Committee on Technology, and Joe also is the chair of the Committee on STEM Education. The actual complexity of that, I often do as a handout, and you won't be able to read, but just to show you, I'm going to put up the following. This shows an org chart, which you don't have to read any of the words in to show you. There's millions of committees. Actually, there's over 150 entities in the NSTC, and most people in the science establishment are totally unaware of it. It's the only thing that well, not the only thing. It's one of the key things that we have in the federal government for doing coordination across agencies. And there's a real reason to do that. And that's because there are opportunities when you bring agencies together to leverage what an individual agency is doing and improve their work by getting combinations of approaches and expertise in areas that they don't have the resources for. It's very difficult to do because each agency, particularly each agency head, thinks they're the only agency in the world and they're the only one know how to do anything and how to do it right. And so they usually go kicking and screaming into that. It's also a burden on the resources of their staff because these things are all staffed by individuals at agencies and they have to take time out of their busy schedule to do that. So one of the things that I had been complaining about is that this administration had really pared this organization down. That org chart is a quarter of what it was when I was in the Clinton and Bush administration. It was much more complex. And when they pared it down, which was a good idea, I thought certain things had been left out, but that's on a different topic. The other entity, and I was there this morning, that you're probably unfamiliar with, that is coordinated by OSTP, another acronym, is something called PCAST. That stands for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. That's a group that's chaired by John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor and my boss, co-chaired by Eric Lander, the head of the Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT, and has vice chairs of William Press and Maxine Savitz. Maxine used to be the vice president of the National Academy of Engineering. So PCAST is an advisory group. It meets every month. It met yesterday and today. It had a public meeting today, private meeting yesterday. It's an advisory group of the nation's leading scientists and engineers who directly advise the president and the executive office of the president. PCAST makes policy recommendations in many areas where understanding of science, technology, and innovation is key to strengthening our economy and forming policy that works for the American people. It's a little hard to see the picture up here. I wanted to point out a couple of things. There are some interesting people on this. It's a mix of people from industry and academia. On the left over here is Eric Schmidt, the CEO of something called Alphabet. It used to be known as Google, and it's now called Alphabet. And then one of my many bosses, a guy named Rick Levin, who was the president of Yale. He since has taken over, left Yale, and is the president of Coursera, a MOOC company. Barack Obama is sitting over here. John Holdren, President's Science Advisor. Way back here, there's Joe Handelsman in the back in blue. There's me, Philip Rubin. And so that's the Roosevelt Room, and that's where we meet. The interesting thing about PCAST in this iteration is this group of individuals actually gets to meet with the president on a regular basis and very succinctly discusses with him science and technology policy, and he listens and they interact. He knows most of the people that are on this group personally, but it's actually a very focused meeting, and particularly because Eric Lander, the co-chair, makes sure that each individual talks without notes and is able to talk conversationally and quickly, and the president usually knows the material better than they do. So in previous administrations, PCAST wasn't as critical and didn't play as key a role. Okay, so enough of the structural wonky stuff. Let's move on to the Neuroscience Initiative. So the Neuroscience Initiative is so broad that I'm not going to talk about most of it. I wanted to give you a sense of the breadth. And by Neuroscience Initiative, we meant all things that this administration is involved with in the broad space of neuroscience. And the role of OSTP was not to direct any of this. It was usually directed by agencies, but coordinated. And that included things like the National Alzheimer's Action Plan, leadership mostly being at the National Institute on Aging at NIH, Interagency Working Group on Neuroscience, which I'm going to drill down a little bit on, and then things like mental health, where we had an executive order related to veterans service members. The thing that I'm going to talk most about today, very small activity actually, in comparison to the budgets on the other things, the BRAIN initiative, so we'll get back to that. Other aspects of mental health, including barriers to access, suicidality, stigma, and then the ethical, legal, and societal impacts. Time constraints prevent me from talking about most of this, but I will touch on a couple things lightly, and I'll focus mostly on the BRAIN initiative. But I did want to mention the Interagency Working Group, again, to give you all, if you haven't been part of this process, a sense of the breadth of what's involved. So this slide shows a portion of the agencies or organizations that meet on a regular basis on the Interagency Working Group. There's at least a couple people in this room who've been at those meetings or are connected with it. And it's sometimes not always clear, but for those who can't see, involved were the Department of Health and Human Services, they were co-chair, National Science Foundation co-chair, Department of Agriculture, and you say, well, why agriculture? Well, first of all, nutrition is important to brain development, but there's also animals, and they're responsible. They have a nervous system too. Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Department of Veterans Affairs, CIA, but they never show up. And if they do, they don't sign, so we don't know who they are. The Environmental Protection Agency, NASA, and then an office that does show up, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and you'll hear a little bit about them. And then some offices in the White House, including OSTP that I mentioned, Office of Management and Budget, OMB, National Drug Control Policy. The reason I'm showing you all this is I think most people are unaware that this much stuff is going on a regular basis, but wasn't going on until we created it. And whether it continues in the future only it depends on whether or not there's a need. We felt that the issues of neuroscience and related areas were of significant importance, that it was time that we ramped up the attention to it. And in part, one of the main reasons we created this group, though it had some specific goals that it created, was to develop a community within the federal government that didn't exist before. It was surprising that many of the people that were at the meetings knew each other via email, but had never met each other in person. And you can build a community of common interest, but you also have to have some focus on deliverables. So the goal of this thing, this interagency group that I don't want to dwell on it, was to enhance certain federal efforts, particularly our understanding of learning and cognition, and applying that to improvements in education. We never got around to that, it turns out, except in terms of one White House meeting, and that's an opportunity in the future. More attention was paid to improving our understanding of neurological conditions in industry and injuries, and developing appropriate resources, tools, and techniques. And that last one is what the focus of most of the science and the talk is going to be about. A lot of progress is going to be made, but I only really want to concentrate, I think, going forward for this talk on one aspect, which is something called the BRAIN Initiative. How many people here have heard of the Brain Initiative, so I can get a sense? How many people have not? Okay, good. So it's pretty mixed. So the Brain Initiative got a lot of attention in the media and is one focused effort. For us, or at least a portion of what we were doing, we considered it as one of the grand challenges that face the nation. Grand challenge is a term that's broadly used by many people in different ways, by many people in science and in different areas. At the White House, we have a very specific meaning and definition, so I'll read it to you. We consider a grand challenge to be, grand challenges are ambitious but achievable goals that harness science, technology, and innovation to solve important national or global problems and that have the potential to capture the public's imagination. So they also have to be something that have the potential for being solved. They're not some, other ways to think about grand challenges are like, what is consciousness? It's like, well, it's an interesting challenge, but we're not going to get an easy answer to that in the short run. So we were looking to get a little bit more focus on this. There currently, I'm sorry, I keep doing the wrong button. There are currently a small set of grand challenges. I'm aware of about 5 that the administration has been involved with. I've got 4 up on the slide, and I'm going to introduce you to a new one if there's time at the end. So one is the Brain Initiative, which we'll get back to in a moment. There's also NASA's Asteroid Grand Challenge. That challenge is to find all asteroid threats to human population and know what to do about them. Like blow them up. USAID's grand challenges for development, including saving lives at birth that catalyzes prevention and treatment for pregnant women and newborns. The Department of Energy's Sunshot Grand Challenge to make solar energy costs competitive with coal by the end of the decade. And EV Everywhere Grand Challenge to make electric vehicles that are affordable as today's gasoline-powered vehicles within the next 10 years. So you can see, at least for some of them, some of these are, they're ambitious. Some of them are potentially achievable. Brain Initiative, to revolutionize our understanding of the human mind and uncover new ways to treat, prevent, and cure brain disorders. So that's the goal. I think it's a little bit harder. We're not trying to understand everything there, but we are trying to catalyze and revolutionize what's going on. So, for the next set of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brain Initiative for those who are unfamiliar with it, just to give a casual thing, and then talk about some of the science that has been developed and is being developed. So, the Brain Initiative is an acronym. So when I have Obama's brain, it really refers to the Brain Initiative. And BRAIN is an acronym that stands for Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. It had a number of acronyms, and there were others that I liked, but that's the one we ended up with. The Brain Initiative was launched on April 2nd, 2013, with approximately $100 million in funding for research supported by the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was the largest contributor in the first year, and the National Science Foundation in the President's fiscal year 2014 budget. So let's step back on the money, because from our perspective, the money wasn't what this was about. What this was about were challenges that faced our nation that are crucial, and understanding whether or not it was the right time to start marshaling some resources. When you look at something like $100 million, is that a lot of money or a little money? It's a little money, yeah. It depends on your perspective. And again, it really wasn't about the money, but on the inside, it actually wasn't any new money here. It was a reallocation of existing money. Right now, things are pretty flat in terms of funding. At the same time, there's a lot of money that goes out to the research community. And the idea here wasn't so much to get a lot of money, but it was to try to get people working together. An example of the scale of that, as Francis Collins pointed out when he unrolled his 2014 budget and someone criticized about the vast amount of money that they were devoting to this, he pointed out, particularly the Neuroscience were complaining about it, that the annual budget for NIH for neuroscience is was in 2014, $5 billion. So a $100 million investment on that scale is not small, but if you target it and try to build something, perhaps it can be catalytic and useful. And so the next few slides, which I'm not going to dwell on, come from an infographic that was released in which we talked about what we're trying to do. The ultimate goal, and I think we're far from it, is understanding things like neurodegenerative diseases, like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's, forms of dementia, also to consider things like PTSD, traumatic brain injury, mental health. We're far from that, but you have to start somewhere, and it's getting more timely in terms of certain tools and theoretical approaches to do that. And we felt that we could certainly start to get portions of a very small initiative going. The key investments in the beginning came from 3 agencies. I mentioned DARPA. So in the beginning, they provided $50 million of their budget for understanding the dynamic functions of the brain and demonstrating breakthrough applications. I'm going to mention a little bit more detail some of their recent investments. NIH was in at approximately $40 million, and the National Science Foundation at $20 million. And again, this was existing. The other thing we were trying to do, though, was in a flat funding environment to think about public-private partnerships. And so very crucial to the development of this initiative was to be working with foundations, key private sector partners. And in the beginning, though it's grown, those partners included the Allen Institute for Brain Science, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and a very small but crucial investment which has grown from the Kavli Foundation, which has been very catalytic in all of these activities in a number of ways. Originally, the Salk Institute was in, but they pulled out after this infographic because they knew that eventually there'd be grant funding, and for conflict of interest reasons, they knew eventually they'd probably want to apply for award and weren't comfortable being, providing the money and then applying for it. And that's always a touchy issue. And they are doing wonderful things that you'll hear about. We also started, particularly at the encouragement of a previous speaker to this group, a woman named Arthi Prabhakar, who's the head of DARPA. I had dinner with her here upstairs, and we had a conversation. And in that conversation, we were talking about the Brain Initiative that was starting to get going. She said, well, that she insisted that there be some attention paid, serious attention paid to the ethical, legal, and societal impacts of emerging technologies, not just neurotechnologies, because they are potentially problematic. And you'll see that as we get more into the science portion of this. And you'll see how that played out in a moment. Before we do, I do want to mention, and this is a very, very hard slide to read, and it's intended more for my reference. I want to point out that efforts like this build on years of work by many people. There were many precursors to this, to what turned into our brain activity. A number of people connected with it like to take the credit, and we're happy that they do. They say, oh, we're the guys, we got together and sent a paper in, and then the Brain Initiative happened. Yeah, right, that's true, but absolutely true. But there was also a lot of other activity. And it stretches back many years. So in the 1990s at NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health at NIH, they were promoting the decade of the brain, and that was followed by a decade of behavior. Then there were some efforts more recently on the decade of the mind. That didn't happen, but a science of mind efforts, very similar to what looks like the Brain Initiative, came about. There were workshops at agencies like the National Science Foundation trying to build what we call convergent science, where the scientists get together. Key in this were early meetings over a decade ago, led by a guy named Mike Rocco at NSF, who led the National Nanotechnology Initiative, and he created a series of meetings called NBIC, Nano Bio Info Cogno, trying to get nanoscientists together with biologists, with computer scientists, and was, I thought, clever enough to bring cognitive scientists in, which rarely happens in the world. So I was delighted and was part of those. And they were very similar kind of efforts to the ones that were developed. Things went on at the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, programs like the revolutionizing prosthetics programs at DARPA had been developed. Foundations like the Ali Gatsby-Kavli workshop led to the brain activity map white paper, which was absolutely catalytic in this. And then we also work with professional societies because it's ultimately up to the community and the scientists to lead in this charge. In April 2014, so on the one-year anniversary, President Obama called for the BRAIN Initiative to be what he called an all-hands-on-deck effort involving not only the federal government, but also companies, health systems, patient advocacy groups, and other organizations. We've now, the effort has now grown to 5 agencies. You'll see a couple more. There's been an enthusiastic response, and there have been major foundations and private research institutions. And instead of us giving money, we asked for others to make commitments to us of what they were doing, a novel way to approach this. And we got commitments of, at this anniversary event of over $240 million, including from very odd places, and you'll see the science like the National Photonics Institute. And I'll try to explain why things like photonics, which has to do with light, are important to neuroscience. At the National Institutes of Health, they've had for many years something called the Blueprint for Neuroscience Research. It's an initiative that pools resources and expertise across 15 NIH institutes and centers. It's a very broad set of activities, and it's been a leading contributor. After the BRAIN Initiative was rolled out, Dr. Collins created, the leader of NIH, created a working group, an advisory group of his advisory committee to help develop a strategic plan by hearing from scientists around the country and also having public meetings. So it's really good to make these things from the ground up and not top down. One of the biggest criticisms we've actually had is that we seem to be doing nothing at the White House. We announced stuff and weren't directing anything. And it was a little bit more hands on that, but it was very intentional that we did not want the central federal government running this thing. Instead, we wanted to help it raise the profile of it, help to coordinate where it could, but have this be built around effective public-private partnerships with ownership coming from the ground roots up, because otherwise it's not going to be sustainable and not really going to happen. And it's not going to continue. The other thing is there was profound bipartisan support, except about spending money, and that's fine. We weren't looking for money. But real encouragement working across the aisle, and everybody's been enthusiastic. So it was one of the few things that the White House did that both sides and both parties were enthusiastic about. But that was encouraging. So this advisory committee was created at NIH, and they came up with something, and you can Google it and look at it if you want, called BRAIN 2025, which helps to map out their scientific vision. Again, time doesn't permit going into detail. They had a broad range of things, and they had to get some focus. And they came down to a set of 7 key problems. Examples include things like looking at the diversity of cell types that are related to neuroscience, looking at the dynamics of brain circuitry. So it's a well-thought-out plan of which they've started to unroll some funding efforts, and I'm going to mention some of those to you. They also identified the need to have good theory underlying this and to develop training and to actually go from the BRAIN Initiative to the brain to integrate what they were doing in a much more comprehensive approach to understand the complex brain circuitry that underlies the brain. So at NIH, where do things stand now? On October 1st, NIH announced its second wave of grants to support the BRAIN Initiative, bringing the NIH investment to $85 million, and it announced 67 new awards totaling more than $38 million that will go to over 131 investigators working at 125 institutions in the United States and 8 other countries. So this is a growing effort. Projects include proposals to develop soft, self-serving electrodes to probe brain activity, ultrasound methods for measuring brain activity, and the use of deep brain stimulation to treat traumatic brain injury. From the perspective of NIH, they released a chart like this that shows their perspective of what has emerged in the last, now it's 2 years, 2 years since this started. The activity has grown from basically 3 agencies and 3 foundations to a complex set of activities. At NIH, these acronyms stand for some of the many institutes involved. For example, NINDS is the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, Mental Health, Drug Awareness, Child Development. Then the other government agencies, OSTP, National Science Foundation, Food and Drug Administration, IARPA, which I'll get to, a lot of universities, and this is just a tiny list. Also, private organizations and foundations, Kavli, Howard Hughes, the Simons Foundation, and many others, and other different kind of private research centers like Genelia, part of Howard Hughes, Allen, Salk, and Cold Spring Harbor. And then finally, corporate interest of places like Google, General Electric, and Scopix in the photonics industry. So what started out as a pretty humble thing, basically kind of went viral very quickly, and that's both good and bad. We wanted to get people's interest, but there can also be a lot of misunderstanding about what you're doing, and there's still a lot of coordination needed in this activity. So, I wanted to mention that this set of activities does involve all the a set of key agencies, and there's an enormous number of things going on at the National Science Foundation. They pretty much have labeled it their Understanding the Brain, and they talk about the multi-scale integration. Fascinating thing about the National Science Foundation, if you're not familiar with it, it's a very small agency compared to the NIH. NIH annual budget, intramural and extramural, is about $31 billion. NSF is about 7. But it's not about the money necessarily. Sometimes it's about the innovation. One fascinating thing about NSF is that it has all the sciences in one building. So it's a real opportunity to get people working together across areas. It's absolutely fascinating. And that's why I went to work there. I was just fascinated by the ability to learn from scientists in different areas. And when I started my process helping on the Neuroscience Initiative, I met with a lot of institute heads and others at NIH, but I also talked to every associate director, the next level of leadership at NSF, because ultimately it's about them finding it exciting. They had already been thinking about these things, as always, and so it was great to work with that team. They're also interested in neurotechnology, research and infrastructure. Both NIH and NSF, for over a decade, had been working together on things like another acronym, CRCNS, collaborative research on computational neuroscience. And so they've had experience working together, and that had worked well, and they brought international partners in. They also look at quantitative theory and modeling of human function, very similar to what you see in the European approach to this, in the European Human Brain Project, and also look at how brain structure abstractly influences the design of other systems. And they give a lot of thought to the workforce development. One problem is people are going to be working in areas and approaches that they're not trained for. So how do you develop the workforce of the future? NIH cares about that, DARPA cares about that, and NSF. And this is a long list of, because you hear mostly about NIH, of some of the recent things that NSF has announced, including things like eager awards, small awards to catalyze stuff, 36 of them in 2014. A very large center called the Center for Brains, that's a typo in there, it should be Brains, Minds, and Machines at a combination of MIT, Harvard, and a number of institutions that is dedicated to the study of intelligence and how the brain produces intelligent behavior. Again, work all over the place. And there's also mention of something called the National Brain Observatory, which I'm going to get to, if time permits, right near the end. Also work at DARPA on a range of different programs, including some really well-known and semi-controversial ones, like this one down here, Restoring Active Memory, in which they're trying to restore memory to service members who have had traumatic brain injuries. And that raises a whole host of ethical considerations. But one of their most famous ones, I don't even know if I put it up here, was the Revolutionizing Prosthetics program, which you might have seen on the 60 Minutes program. It was interesting because we were trying to push that as an initiative, and we had given it to our Grand Challenges team along with this. And they loved the Revolutionizing Prosthetics. That was on a Friday. On Sunday, there was a segment on 60 Minutes called Revolutionizing Prosthetics. On Monday, I'd show up at the office and they go, you know that Revolutionizing Prosthetics thing? We're not going to do that. I go, oh, why not? And they go, it was just on TV. You know, people will think it's already done. And I said, but, you know, there's so much that needs to be done. They said, it'll get done, but let's move on to the other one. So what I did instead is, we did at OSTP, is we hired the guy who was on air who was running that program, Colonel Jeffrey Ling, to be my assistant director for biomedical innovation. He then eventually went back on to lead the biological technologies office at DARPA. So lots of things going on at DARPA. We also brought some new partners in, the Food and Drug Administration, and a guy who was directing the day-to-day neuroscience initiative working for me, Carlos Pena, is over there. And one of the things that he was always trying to have us take more seriously was enhancing transparency and predictability of the regulatory landscape. It's a very difficult process to do so, particularly at the FDA. But they've joined and are working in a number of different ways. And there's a lot of potential there and a lot of excitement. We also have two new partners. I'm sorry, FDA is one, the other is IARPA. Most people aren't familiar with that. That's the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. Sounds kind of scary. And so I invite you, when you get a chance, to Google it, look at the programs it's doing, and give yourself a sense of them. I was pretty impressed. I know some of the very young and very talented people there, and it's really the stuff kind of closest to areas of psychology, intelligence, memory that I was doing. None of it is classified work, and it's kind of exciting and very enthusiastic group doing that. So lots has been going on. Then, continuing on this, we're about to get to some of the technologies. There was a recent meeting on the Hill at the public Senate meeting room hosted by the Kavli Foundation, in which they announced 3 new Kavli centers at Johns Hopkins University, at the University of California, San Francisco, and Rockefeller University to join the other Kavli institutes. And so they're building a national and now international, because there's also stuff in Norway, network of Kavli neuroscience centers. So this activity, has gotten a lot of traction and going. Again, I don't want to get marred in it. I did want to mention that a lot of what's driving this is the development of new neurotechnologies, but also the recognition that things have been developing rapidly over the past decade. And I'm not an expert in all these areas. I know that there are people in this room who know many of these things significantly better. I also know that there's many people in this room who've never heard of any of this stuff. And so what I wanted to do was to give you a little bit of a flash through some of the underlying technologies, some of which I've worked with for years, some of which I haven't, that you might not be familiar with. And we could drill way down, but time is short, so I'm just going to give highlights and mention them. I was prepared to go into some of the underlying science for each of them, but let's mention them. So the one that people tend to know best is functional magnetic resonance imaging. Many people have had injuries and they've had structural MRIs to look at things like broken limbs. But this is a technique that, so I was a CEO of a place called Haskins Laboratories, and we do a lot of cognitive neuroscience there, particularly working with children, and particularly working on things like dyslexia. But there's also work that goes on in everything from at places like NIDA, drug awareness, and lots of different kind of cognitive stuff. So functional means that you're using this imaging technology to look at some function that somebody does. One function is to do nothing. It's called the resting state. And you learn a lot about how things are going on. The other thing that's been learned, now I have something that's a little unique. I have something called color anomia. And I have a degree of color blindness. So all the imaging pictures that people see when they're shown in what's called an MRI, magnetic resonance image, people go to these academic talks and they see these cool pictures. None of them work on me. I could care less, including the one that's up on the screen. I don't really. It's not that I don't see the colors. It doesn't mean anything to me. They can be seductive, and one has to be careful about seduction. At the same time, one thing that we're starting to learn, particularly in some areas, that it's not about phrenology, learning about where something is necessarily simply localized, but that the brain is a complex system. And it's a complex system in a human being or animal, and that human being or animal is in the real world, moving around and doing stuff. And so we need to have the tools that help us learn a little bit about the complexity. And it's not, though you've heard talks here about connectomics, which is important. I'm going to be mentioning some of that. It's not about simply creating a wiring diagram of the brain. On its own, that gets you nowhere. If you don't know what the brain's there to do, and if you don't know the behaviors people are involved in, great. So you know how things are connected. And we've seen that. We can map out every neuron in something called the C-slug aplasia, and still not really know why or how it does what it does. But it's still important to know that. So if you're interested in sports physiology, it is important to know the structure of the body, the muscles, and how you move. So I'm of the belief that it is important to know stuff, but it's also particularly important to think about the dynamics, how things change over space and time, and to think about the complexity of the circuitry that's there. And we're beginning to have tools to map that out. One is functional magnetic resonance imaging. It has a problem. It gives very good spatial resolution and horrible temporal resolution. You only get a picture every once in a while. Another technology that's often used is something called electroencephalography. It's non-invasive, though that little net or helmet looks scary. It's in general, though, you can do it invasively. This is a non-invasive approach. And we've got, in this particular slide that's up, you're seeing also somebody with a little virtual reality viewing device on. We use this technology with infants at our laboratories. And with EEG, which is a method, it's an electrophysiological technique that looks at changes in voltage and really gives you very the opposite of functional MRI. You get very, very good temporal resolution and pretty bad spatial resolution. But it turns out it's good for certain things, and particularly looking at global phenomena and certain areas of the brain. And it turns out the two technologies can be used together, as can others. So those are a couple of the common ones. There's a very cool company that just moved from, I think, Spain to Massachusetts called NE Neuroelectrics. That's using technologies like this to do essentially what they call wired health, to get diagnostic information here, and then through electrical stimulation, using it to create a feedback loop. Another technology uses properties of the infrared spectrum, and it's called, here I've labeled it as functional near-infrared brain imaging. We usually call it NIRS, near-infrared spectroscopy. And again, is a way of using light, and I brought that up for a reason, to be able to detect changes in brain activity. Sometimes these things are done indirectly. So in magnetic resonance imaging and in near-infrared spectroscopy, it's really an indirect approach that's getting a measure of changes in blood flow or oxygen, the oxygenation, the amount of oxygen in the blood that is an indirect measure of brain activity. And again, that poses certain problems, but also brings up other opportunities. Light, and I mentioned photonics earlier, has also been used for at least the past decade in something called optogenetics. And again, I assume most people are not familiar with this, but this is a revolutionary development that lets you control, now instead of measurement, control the activities of neurons, taking advantage of the ability to genetically alter the light sensitivity of different genes. Different genes can be created to be sensitive to different colors of light, and you can both gate their activity on and off. This is a revolutionary development for a number of reasons. One, because you can actually control activity. Again, it could be potentially used in restoring damage. But it's also good because it gives you the kind of detailed measure that lets you look at other more abstract measures like magnetic resonance imaging and see whether or not you're getting any basis in reality. Another technique that was developed by Jeff Lichtman and Dan Berger and their team is a method of using the electron microscope technique on this, in this case, on mouse brain tissue, to get very detailed measurements of everything that's going on in every structure, and then to annotate that and recreate it. So a number of tools have been coming along, and I'm just giving you a taste. There's a whole host that have been recently funded. So as we move towards the end of this, I also did at least want to mention, without going into detail, that I had raised, if you look at these technologies, they raise some, potentially some ethical challenges. They could be misused, as can most things, most technologies that are developed. And there's lots of debates and lots of discussions we can have about it. But when Arthi Prabhakar asked us to consider this, what we decided to do was to put her in touch, in a way, with the President's Bioethics Commission. So the President has a Bioethics Commission, and it is chaired by Amy Gutman. She's the President, University of Pennsylvania. And the President basically directed this commission. The formal name is the Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, to explore the ethical, legal, and societal implications raised by the research initiative and other advances in neuroscience. That commission produced two reports called Gray Matters 1 and 2. I can summarize the first one. It basically says ethics is important and you should have ethics in all things. We wanted them to go into a little bit more detail. That's important to send that message. But, you know, and we wanted to, we hope that they got into more detail. In their second report, they selected some aspects of ethical consideration. In November 2014, the NIH held a big workshop on neuroethics, and they started to drill down and come up with some priorities. NSF has been paying attention to it. There are also many other ethicists who have been skeptical and cautious about these technologies. I wanted to draw to your attention three. All of these, disclaimer, are very close friends of mine. Martha Farah at University of Pennsylvania has one of the classic textbooks on neuroethics, so you should take a look at it. Jonathan Moreno, and I don't remember if Jonathan's been a speaker here. He also was staffing in part the Bioethics Commission. He's a professor at University of Pennsylvania also, by coincidence. And he wrote a book called Mind Wars. It's a cautionary book about the potential misuse of these technologies in the military and of some of the benefits of these technologies. And then finally, Wendell Wallach, who is mostly written on, he's trying to, part of the group trying to prevent the development of autonomous killing machines, has written a new book called The Dangerous Master, How to Keep Technology from Slipping Beyond Our Control. And so, this is just a taste of a large portion. There have been two recent developments. Before I end, I wanted to mention. One is something you might have read about if you follow any of this, called the National Brain Observatory. It appeared again in congressional, the thing I started with, congressional conference language, probably inserted by Congressman Chaka Fattah, a great friend of the neuroscience community, a congressman from Philadelphia, encouraging the National Science Foundation to help coordinate an effort to get the national laboratories involved and to particularly think about the development of larger centers. And in October, the NSF had a workshop to this end. And finally, to this morning at the PCAST meeting, there was in the public meeting a discussion broadly on the reinvigoration of their nanotechnology effort. And they also mentioned a new nanotechnology-inspired grand challenge. And it's actually called the Nanotechnology-Inspired Grand Challenge for Future Computing. And I can succinctly read it to you. It says it's to create a new type of computer that can proactively interpret it and learn from data, solve unfamiliar problems using what it's learned, and operate with the energy efficiency of the human brain. So we can do some of this to a degree. Some of us have talked about this and worked on these issues for years. Doing it with the efficiency of the human brain is a considerable challenge, but it's the kind of thing that spurs people to do that. Finally, this is April 2nd, 2013. Again, another picture. This is moments before the president is about to announce the BRAIN Initiative. So that's probably familiar with President Barack Obama right there. And I've forgotten everybody's name because my memory is going, but some of them. This is a wonderful neuroscientist named Terry Sejnowski from University of California, San Diego, and the Salk Institute that I had mentioned. That's Alan Jones, the executive director of the Allen Institute for Brain Science. That's a different Alan. That other Alan is Paul Allen, most known as being the co-founder of Microsoft and the owner of the Seattle Seahawks 12, for the fans of the Seahawks. Arthi Prabhakar, a previous speaker here, a member of PSW, and the director of DARPA. Bob Kahn, Robert Kahn, the president of the Kavli Foundation. Amy Gutman, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, and the head of the President's Bioethics Commission. I assumed they had met. They had never met. And the president comes walking in, and I had been standing at that moment between Arthi and Cora Merritt, and because we know each other, we're hanging out. And then the president starts to come in. I'm supposed to get out of the way because I'm staff. And Amy shouts out, she goes, "Man, you're in great shape." And he looks, he goes, "Hey, so are you?" And they run up. And it turned out they had never actually physically met, though they talked. This is Cora Merritt, one of my mentors, and the former acting director of the National Science Foundation. Jerry Rubin, no relation. I have another real cousin named Jerry Rubin, the head of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. The very tall Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health. Mi-Young Chun from Kavli Foundation, who really has been just amazing in getting a lot of the activities going. Hovering in the background, one little guy, two fat guys. That fat guy's me, looking like a proud papa, and the person who really makes it all happen. And that's a guy who I haven't talked much about, named Tom Khalil, the Deputy Director of Technology, who probably is the single person most responsible for at least the BRAIN Initiative portion, because that's the way Tom views the world. So I hope that gave you a sense. I'm sorry that I didn't drill down as much into some of the scientific detail, because each of the technologies that I talked about, I could talk about for an hour. They're fascinating and rely on incredible revolutions across the sciences: physics, material science, electrical engineering, computer science, psychology, neuroscience, biology, are all working together and working in partnership. That kind of convergent science is key to this initiative, and that's what we were trying to do. Open for questions.
So we do have time for some questions, and there is a procedure for questions. We have some people with microphones. If you'll hold up the microphones. And if you'll raise your hand and keep your hand up, they will come to you and give you the microphone. When you get the microphone, stand up, tell us your name, Tell us if you're a member or you're not. If you're not a member, you have to pay your dues. No. If you're not a member, there's no penalty. And ask a question. First question, I think, is at the back there.
Hi, Jeff Cavaservice, non-member, sorry. I just wanted to say that I love the fact that you're a former CEO of the Haskins Laboratory, because I first met Carol Haskins here in the Cosmos Club 25 years ago.
And as an aside, you can see his picture right out on the wall. I'll show you.
He's out there. I was very tickled by the fact that this was somebody almost on the cusp of the 21st century I was meeting who had written a book that had been reviewed by George Orwell. There you go. The question I have for you, it's kind of a devil's advocate question.
Sure.
So the BRAIN Initiative is the grand challenge, and you've listed a lot of really cool science and technology things that are coming out of this, and dozens and dozens of agencies and other entities that have collaborated on it. And at the end, you'll have something to show for it. But as you said, it's a relatively small amount of money.
Yep.
And the question is, shouldn't the president, if he really wanted to set a grand challenge, have done something like, let's do a Manhattan Project to solve one of the big problems confronting us, either Alzheimer's disease or, let's say, helping returning veterans who have traumatic brain injuries and PTSD to recover, and then direct all of those agencies toward that one goal, rather than sort of scattering them across these other numbers of initiatives?
It's a great question. I don't consider it a devil's advocate at all. I consider it a crucial question. We were discussing it a little bit early at dinner, and there's a young scientist, I probably mispronounced his name, Carl Deseroth, is that how it's? Yeah, who is identified with optogenetics and with other systems. He's at Stanford now, and has two amazing students at MIT, Ed Boyd and others. And I was reading something by him yesterday, and he would argue the opposite. He would argue that if you put everything in one centralized effort, then all the revolutionary work that he and others did would never have happened, because you'd be focusing on one thing. In our discussion a little bit earlier, and I was talking to Heather Dean, who's sitting over here, who has worked on many of these things and has been one of the biggest promoters through the Neuropolicy Organization for neuroscience in the DC community and more broadly. I don't think it's an either-or thing. So I, as the CEO of Haskins, which is the tiniest of organizations, we're so small that we were part of something called ARI, the Association of Independent Research Institutes, all the big bio ones. We're so far out on the cusp of being tiny, it was amazing. But we were a center. And one thing that you find about at least centers of that sort is that even though everybody was doing individual work, you have a coherent theme that you're working around, and you reduce some of the burden on the scientists. So to get one more comment on your question, I think that in a certain way, Tom Khalil and the president, and John Holdren, president's science advisor, actually see this as the potential for something of the effort that you're there, but the resources aren't there. So what we were trying to do is build the community, one, but also identify the area, because there's lots of other things we didn't do. And the thing that I felt, and not everyone agrees, is I thought we were throwing, and we are, a big softball to the community, saying, there's some opportunity out there. It's up to you to seize it and to make it into something else. And at the moment, we actually don't know how to turn it into a moonshot, because I think we're in the pre-phase. What we're trying to do is provide the resources and to see if enough comes of it. Well, two things happen. One, an enormous amount of interest. We were delighted. And to me, real interest in people like the National Photonics Initiative, who are on the outside. So I don't think this, though people have talked about the analogy to the Human Genome Initiative, I think this is different. I think it's a little bit more speculative. And when you compare it to some of the other grand challenges, at least three of the ones I mentioned, it's much more preparatory than those. So I don't think we're quite there yet. But I think it raises the profile enormously of neuroscience and related areas, because I think we also have to take seriously things like cognitive science and the relation to behavior to a level that it's been very hard to do in a government that's dominant. Now, I became the head of all of science, so I was speaking for all of it, but it's really dominated by physics, large bio, and the physical sciences. while the problems that we face in a nation are about science that cuts across all these different areas.
Tim?
I observe that you have a very broad range of research institutions, universities, large companies, but it seems to me one of the largest investments in brain research comes from big pharma, because they build the psychoactive drugs, they build the treatments for Alzheimer's, they are constantly attempting to uncover chemical or manipulable parts of the brain, but they're not joining in. What's the story?
So I would have a slightly different take. I think that's mostly accurate. So I didn't mention a group that was one of the catalytic groups and still meets. So there's a group, and again, I'm getting wonky here and I apologize. I mentioned the national academies when I started. And I mentioned that one of the branches now called the National Academy of Medicine. Prior to that, to a month ago, it was called the Institute of Medicine. For over a decade, they've had the IOM, that's the Institute of Medicine, Forum on Neuroscience and related areas. It was chaired by Alan Leshner. For those who don't know him, Alan Leshner, until a couple of months ago, was the head of the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and also had been head of National Institute of Mental Health and other things, and was a real booster for this area, and probably was, again, in the top 5 people for years trying to promote this area. That group is the group in which both big and small pharma gets together with agency people and with academics. So that's the good news. The bad news is pharma has pulled out, big and small, but mostly big, from the drug development across the board. And again, Larry would know more about this kind of stuff than I do, but what I observed is that it's not a great time for them, and part of what we continue to do is to try to get them engaged, but also that's why we mentioned the FDA, to help them by reducing some of the burdens that make it very expensive and difficult for them to bring appropriate drugs to market. They invest a lot of money, and if it's not going to make money for their stockholders, I guess it becomes more difficult. Government can be a big barrier in this, and in part, that's one of the things that we wanted to have in the long run to solve that, because ultimately, big pharma is going to play, it needs to play, and will play a bigger role in some aspects of that. We also pivoted the focus away from the broader neuroscience initiative that I was talking about to a function, to focus on neurotechnologies and to kind of finesse that.
My name is Jim Griffin, and I'm a member. Can you hear me?
I can.
I was stunned at the complexity that you display. My experience in science has been 6 levels down, at least from the White House.
Right.
And I really wonder whether anybody in the White House or other government agencies has thought of having chroniclers, trained historians, who would record these items and make them available to future American generations so that we could study how some things worked and how some things didn't work.
So that's, again, a great question. So the answer is, to a degree that exists, but won't totally satisfy your interest. So NIH has a formal historian who chronicles a portion of what goes on. Just so you know, the title of my talk addresses your question. Obama's Brain, A View of Science Policy from Inside the White House is, so I just retired, and starting in January, I've been working on a book called Obama's Brain, A View of Science Policy from the Inside. So this talk is my getting you to make my book better by hearing what your questions are and what your concerns are, and by me trying to learn the material, because I need to wrap this book up before I keel over. And so, in part, I've noticed that I was a bench scientist for 35 years. At least a couple of people are familiar with my laboratory and the work I did. In a cellar, 35 years, no window, working on tiny little stuff, talking to nobody, having nothing to do with government, until I had my stroke, and I wanted to do something else when I recovered. But one thing I've noticed being involved for over a decade with science, that even talking to leading scientists at the agency, and when I say leading, I mean institute, directors, agency heads, Many of them are unfamiliar with their own science apparatus, and they don't have to be familiar. That's not what their role is. What I thought is fascinating is that it would help other scientists and the public be aware that these things don't happen the way you read about them in the front page of the New York Times. And I'll be talking about that. That actually, it's lots of things happening in lots of places over a lot of years. Yes, there's an apparatus and all these flowcharts. It's good to know about them. It's not good to over-worry about them. But it can help for people to be aware. Some people who are very hip, and there were a group of scientists, George Church, one of the inventors of synthetic biology, Paul Alivisatos, one of the leaders of nanotechnology. They were at a Kavli workshop and were just brainstorming and came up with what's called the brain activity map, which was one of the white papers we got to. It shouldn't just be scientists who've been there and are in the know. So I'm hoping to write a casual book, a little bit about my medical history, and a little bit about, not a formal thing, about some of the complexity and some of the structure, so that others who aren't part get a little bit of the historical sense of how these things happen, but recognizing that I have one perspective and there'll be 50 other people with slightly different perspectives. So a portion of what I'm going to be doing is interviewing some of those people to get their take, because we all view it slightly differently on how things happen. And we're absolutely not all aware of stuff. So I'll read stuff and just laugh, because I'll hear, oh, a certain paper was sent in and stuff happened. I'll go, great, but the idea was pitched 18 months before that. And then I'll hear, but you were unaware because you weren't here yet, that something else happened 2 years before that. So there's a lot, but it's hard to write. So I'm going to be writing an informal one. And there is a formal historian at NIH, I think.
Stuart Sweet, I am a member. So what do you think of Ray Kurzweil's Singularity University? And is he right, is the singularity near?
Not a fan of Ray Kurzweil, and I'm not a fan of the singularity.
Why?
I think so.
That's a direct answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ray is a brilliant marketer. And I think the singularity, particularly as Werner Vinge, when he first unrolled the idea, is a fascinating idea. But I'm one of those on the side. So again, not everybody in the room is familiar with the singularity or the Singularity Institute or Ray Kurzweil. So real quickly, singularity is a concept first introduced by a science fiction writer named Werner Vinge, that eventually we're going to reach a point where, if you follow Moore's law, the notion that things are accelerating in terms of processing power, that all of a sudden there's going to be a singularity, a unique event in which after that there's an explosion of development, and it will change the way everything happens. Possibly, I mean, that may possibly happen. I don't have any problem with that aspect. What I have a problem is with the hubris that we actually know anything. To me, it's demeaning and insulting. Not Ray. I mean, he's a big booster. From what I've seen, being a cognitive scientist, I'm looking at something like that light over there, and I'd like to, like people to explain how they know that a light is a light, or a ball is a ball, or a dog is a dog. We don't have unified concepts on how we do the simplest things. We should not be naive that either understanding how every neuron is connected to every other neuron is going to tell us a lot of everything, particularly when you have glial cells, chemicals, and we don't even know how one single small neuron to dendrite interaction happens, because it's very complex. At the same time, science is a fascinating enterprise in which there are challenges. And what I like about things like neuroscience and cognitive science, so I started in biophysics and other areas, but they were too easy. What I like about these areas where you start to get the human element and the biological element and the need to cross the sciences, and is that harder problems are fascinating. So my problem with the singularity is that it relies on a couple things that may or may not happen. Like the belief that just having computational power alone is going to lead to stuff. I'm more impressed, significantly more impressed, another previous speaker here, by stuff which I didn't think I would because I was skeptical, with two things that I never thought I'd be fond of. One is IBM's Watson project. For people not familiar with it, there's a lot of TV ads now showing Watson, which is their computational model that they're now using in the health arena, but they have ads on with Bob Dylan. It talks about how it's singing songs. The other thing is something that I thought I would hate because it was my area, which is speech recognition Siri. And again, we were talking about this earlier. So for those not familiar, you have a phone and you have something called Siri in here, which is a thing. I don't use Siri, by the way. I use something else that you can talk to. And one of the issues in speech recognition is skeptics, like myself, just like Singularity, would always say, it doesn't work. I would argue now that Siri works all the time. And let me prove that to you. So you turn Siri on, and you say, Siri, what do you know about autism? And Siri responds, I'm sorry, I didn't understand you. So that's actually how things work. That's real. That's how I talk to my kids. It's not a talking typewriter or Moore's law or something that's an explosion. It's about real complex interaction. And it turns out somebody got the insight about things like autospell, that we'll type stuff in, it gets it wrong, gets it right, but at least it gets us in the ballpark. So things are squishier. So I tend to be a little skeptical because I just am a little upset that, Ray continues to push and market and think that we know a lot more than we don't know. It turns out we don't know a lot, but working together and with advances like cloud and big data, deep learning, we make a little stab. So that's my slightly warped take on Ray and the singularity. Takes too many pills, too.
My name is Bruce Murray. I'm just a visitor. I'm curious as to how these large and complex structures of extremely talented people from so many fields actually interact among themselves to produce something. Is there...
So I would say I would say the following. I think they interact poorly because they are human beings, right. And that's their strength. One of the challenges that I had, so I was in Jo Handelsman's role. If you don't know, she's the Associate Director for Science, leading all areas of science. And at least when I was there, I would deal a lot with international partners. And they would get infuriated with the United States of America, as we all, and say, how come you're the White House? How come you don't tell everybody what to do? And I said, because this country is about a conversation of multiple stakeholders, many of whom who don't agree with each other. So, that sounds like an abstract answer. I had the good fortune to be involved many times with the National Science and Technology Council. So this group of disparate agencies. And it's like herding cats. So what I found is that it works if you have something that's real and meaningful that people care about in their hearts and they're willing to devote their time. It works if you get a little bit of the administrators out of the way, because they're great, great people, including I'm not a great person, but I'm an administrator, but they can stick their nose and they think they know everything and want to do stuff. What you want to find is the talent. And what you find is if the problem's real, if you give people a little freedom, that out of a large group, a small subset will come together and create a dynamic. It doesn't always happen, but I found that the hit rate is better than the fail rate on that, and that out of a big group, some people will pull out of it, and it's not that they become leaders. They become the ones who are kicking around the great stuff, and we see this a number of times, but there have to be a number of other elements. So I think, again, it's a recognition something's happening, but also in science we see that. Increasingly, it doesn't have to be that way. I come from an area where everybody does the same research for 50 years and doesn't talk to anybody except their immediate colleagues. But increasingly, being at the NSF and being at the White House, you see there's incredibly exciting things happening where different fields are getting together in ways that didn't happen before. You just can't force it. And again, we were trying to create something without forcing it. So I always saw it as creating a big softball, an opportunity And I would always get amused that the people closest to it, like the neuroscience and psychologists, would hate it the most. And those at some distance would see the opportunity and go, this is really cool. How can I be part of it?
So I think that was one more question here. Bob?
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a member. What kinds of things help in setting the priorities for what's going on?
Yeah, so that's, again, a very important issue, and it also gets back to your question. Turns out there's no uniform answer to that. I wish there was. At DARPA, for example, and I don't know for those who got to meet Arthi Prabhakar when she came to speak, Arthi and DARPA don't seek outside advice. What they do is they get outside program people who are innovative, and what she instead does is promote innovation. At NIH, a very different approach. Their approach being more careful and not more thoughtful. They were very thoughtful. They realized there's a very broad set of issues, and without community buy-in, you're never going to get anywhere. If the scientists don't care about it, they'll kill it. And that's what happened with the European project. It's called the EU Human Brain Project. One guy who's a great guy, but was kind of autocratic, and there wasn't a lot of input at the beginning, was running the thing. And so the others who weren't part just sniped at the thing legitimately, and it's a mess. And so what NIH did is it already has an advisory committee. It went to that advisory committee, got some of the best people, tried to make it as broad as possible, and then Francis Collins very wisely tried to take that group and get a little focus to set the priorities. Because what you end up with is 1,000 ideas. But he knows he's got limited money, limited resources, and he has to match those priorities that the scientists and the public identify with actually the need that he's aware of, and with the skill set that he has. And so he narrowed that down. At NSF, finally, to give you just a third example, and I'm most impressed with the way they do stuff. And again, I'm a child of NIH, not NSF. So NSF has a bunch of directorates. So directorates, that's areas like social sciences, biology, the physical sciences, the geosciences. For each one, it has something called an AD. I think it's an assistant director or associate director. Every Tuesday, they meet and they brainstorm. Over the years, and I've followed and worked with that group for years, it's the most dynamic and innovative group I've seen. Now, it depends on who's in the room. Sometimes there are people who are more innovative than others, but it's an incredibly exciting dynamic. So you have a leadership thing in which they're having a conversation, and all of these places have the most important things. They're program managers and they're scientists who they get the input from. So what we were doing was simply listening. We set our priorities by trying to listen. You see stuff like optogenetics, and you go, there's a revolution going on out there. And you see a number of things, and you realize there's starting to be innovative things. You also see that first slide I put up with the problems, like traumatic brain injury, neurodegenerative disease, and I didn't even give you the beginning of it. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. We need to start thinking about how to do stuff because we're so far from the singularity and from the solution that we're going to have to work for years. So I think it's a mix of things. I'm sorry there's no easy answer.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So before you go, we'd like to
I love
present you
presents.
with a small token of appreciation for coming here and spending time with us and giving this lecture.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Framed announcement of your lecture.
Thank you very much.
I think Carl wants a better picture. We have to hold it
You
like,
got to do this. That way?
like this. There we go. And we shake hands.
Oh, well, hold on, because I have this silly thing in my hand.
There we go. There we go. Okay. That's yours. So if you'll just go have a few things. Okay, before we adjourn.